Would you please welcome congressional candidate, Republican for the 4th District of Congress, Dr. Art Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you. I long ago, when I was a graduate student in chemistry, I knew a very fine young lady, and I was determined that we would spend our life together, and I was trying to convince her of this. But something was amiss. I wasn't succeeding. So I was sure we didn't understand. So something she didn't understand, surely I could correct this, and I took her to dinner at a Chinese restaurant. And if you can imagine the scene, this young man downloading his brain and his heart and everything to this young lady. She's enduring all this, but I'm doing my best. And the dinner was over, the fortune cookies came, and my fortune cookie read, "Young man who has open book is soon on shelf." And it was right. And she was probably right. She had a very fine life, not married to me, and I found a wonderful young scientist. We worked together for 17 years, and after she died, I had the wonderful privilege of growing up with our children together, and they're all scientists and engineers. So I think she was right. Now I'm engaged in the most difficult, persuasive effort of my life, and I come to you with an open book, just like 50 years ago. And I do this because I have great confidence in the American people. I am sure that they understand enough. They, like that young lady, will make the right decision, not just for this little tiny race that I'm involved in, which is a very small part of what we need to do together, but throughout the nation. I think that this election, both the presidential election, the congressional election, the House races, all the elections that are before us in November, will be decided by a dialogue that is taking place within the American people. In the case of the Oregon races, a dialogue within Oregon. And I think the best thing we can do to enhance that dialogue, of course there are many physical things we can do, organizing, going door to door, all the things that have been spoken about before here. But I think primarily we need to inject in that dialogue as much information as possible so that the people have as informed a dialogue as possible. And this book, it's different. Now, no one's done this in a congressional race before. It reminds me of a story about a man whose son was always asking him about penguins. So the father bought his son a book about penguins. The son looked at the book, looked through it a little bit, and said, this book tells me more about penguins than I wanted to know. And this book, no doubt, tells many voters more than they want to know. Some will read the whole thing, some will read a chapter or two, some will just look over the cover, but it's our effort to inject more information into the dialogue before us. But why are we doing this at all? Why, in our case, is a family with a scientist and 6 scientists and engineer children, not children, young adults now, they're all down there, I don't know where they're over here. Today, if you shake hands with them, you'll notice their hands are blue because they made those highway signs yesterday with their own hands. They make everything for our campaign. Why are we doing this? Why do you have this family of scientists and engineers from Cave Junction running for office? In fact, why all across the country do you have what I would call real people running for office? People who have done other things in life and prefer to do those other things in life. And one after another are taking time off to try to improve the mix of candidates we have for our elections. And I think it's clear why it's happening. We have very serious problems in our country. When Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, he wrote that it was common sense that an island would not rule a continent. And he wrote that it was common sense that a free people would not be ruled by a king. And further, he wrote that it wasn't common sense to let the job wait till later because it would be harder to fix the problem as time passed. He wrote that in February 1776. By December 1776, he knew how hard the problem would be. So he wrote another pamphlet, beginning with the famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls." 6 days later, the American Army crossed the Delaware with 2 future presidents in the boats. And 5 years later, they prevailed. And the Founding Fathers decided that our country would be a U-turn in history, a 180-degree U-turn in history. Throughout history, for thousands of years, with the exception of a few small failed experiments, people had been ruled by big governments. People had been subjects, not citizens. The people's liberty and freedom and lives had not stood above the state. The state had stood above them. And they thought we should be different. In our country, we would stand above the state. That we needed a government to defend our country. We needed a constitution to direct them in such a way that they would defend the country, do a few other simple things that we needed to do together. And they also wanted a constitution that would protect us from that government and a constitution that would protect us from each other, because we're people. They knew we had all the idiosyncrasies of ordinary people. They also knew that within the human race, there is always a small group that wants power. I like to watch Indiana Jones movies because Harrison Ford and I are the same age. And I figure, you know, if Indy can do those things, maybe I can too. But in one point, Harrison, the Indy's sidekick says to him, "Why are they doing this, Indy? Why? And Indiana replies, "Fortune and glory, kid, fortune and glory." In our vernacular, money and power. Within the human race, there's always a small group that gravitates toward the center, rises and tries to build in institutions that enslave the rest of the people. My opponent a few months ago was in Portland haranguing the Occupy rallies. He had a sign, "I am the 99%. Well, he's not the 99%, he's a multimillionaire, but I don't care. He's not, the 99% is not our problem, and the 1% is not our problem. Our problem is the 0.001% that exists in every human population that rises until it tries to create governments that enslave us all." Now, and we have a serious problem with that today. You all know this. You wouldn't be here if you didn't understand these things. To summarize a little bit, we have 300,000 laws and regulations passed by Congress and agencies that they have empowered that have constantly diminish our abilities to produce and to live our lives. We have oppressive overtaxation that does the same thing. And we have the debt. The debt is, in my view, one of the 3 things that is destroying the American economy and destroying our freedom. But think about that debt. Since my opponent's been in office, it's increased 700%. He's voted for those things, the way to spend the money, the way to borrow the money, and so forth. But how do you collateralize that debt? You don't borrow $10 trillion without some collateral. The collateral, of course, is us. Our labor, our children's labor, our grandchildren's labor. They have collateralized debt to borrow money that they have already spent with the labor of Americans that have not yet been born. Yet involuntary servitude has been illegal in this country since the Civil War. We have allowed our Congress to depart in a tremendous way from the Constitution. They have done endless unconstitutional things to us, and if we had more time, you know, I'm beginning to get the picture of being a candidate, and I talk and talk and talk, but you're protected because they told me I shouldn't talk too long. But you understand this. We all know what these problems. Why do we have these problems? Who is to blame for these problems? After all, they set up a constitution. The Constitution specifies a Congress. The Congress swears to uphold the Constitution, and we're allowed to change the members of Congress every couple of years. We're the ultimate protection of ourselves and of our country. So why do we have these problems? Who's to blame? Well, I think of a speech I saw my friend astronaut Scott Carpenter give about the space program. They talk about who was to blame when 3 men burned up on the ground in a capsule during the moon program. Who was to blame when the O-rings went wrong and destroyed a space shuttle? Who was to blame when a space shuttle was destroyed by the tile problem? Scott says it's not the problems. It wasn't the blame for the particular thing that happened to the equipment. It was complacence. He says we were complacent. He says we knew, the astronauts and engineers, that the O-rings were a problem. They've been causing us trouble all along. And we knew that the tiles were falling off the shuttles, and this was dangerous, and we knew about the oxygen atmosphere in the capsule. But he says we got away with it. And we became complacent. Year after year, we got away with these things. It was our complacence that destroyed these vehicles and the men and women in them, not some specific thing. And I think we've been complacent. There's been no lack among us of people who worked for liberty. There's been no lack of scholars and institutions and people dedicated to maintaining within us the spirit and mechanism of our Constitution and of the way of life that our founding fathers planned for us. But we haven't listened. I haven't listened. I've been a scientist all my life. I've spent my life in the laboratory. I've done a lot of things that interested me, but I wasn't worrying about this very much. I had friends who were. I read about it, but probably like most of you, I wasn't spending very much time on politics. But now, because we have allowed these things to go so far, I would estimate, and I think it's reasonable to estimate, that economically, socially, and all other ways, we have now given up about half of our freedom to people in Washington who are no longer following our Constitution and no longer are interested in the way of life that our founders planned for us. And that needs to stop. And the things they've been doing to us are now cutting into our prosperity, now making it impossible for our entrepreneurs to function, now causing more and more of our industries to move abroad. China was mentioned here. China now makes 46% of the world's steel. We make 6%. You can go on and on about this. But think about some fundamental indicators in our economy. When our country was healthy, before this statism caught up with the flywheel of American progress, the tremendous thing which was created by 200 years of freedom in this country, we had about 30% of our people employed. The rest were homemakers, young people, and older people. Steady, 30%. Then about 1970, it started to climb. It climbed to 47%. As 50 million more Americans entered the workplace, primarily to try to keep their prosperity constant in a nation which was gradually succumbing to the statism from Washington. In year 2000, that peaked and now has gone down to 42%. They need more jobs, but they're not there. Gradually, our economy has ground up. You can see it in the employment figures. You can see it in another thing that's even more telling. In the 1950s and 60s, when we had 30% employed, 10 to 12% were in manufacturing, logging, and mining. A third of our workers made things, and the other two-thirds were in the many vital public and private service industries who recycled the wealth created by our manufacturing industry. That was 10 to 12%. By the year 2000, it was 6%. Today, it's 4%. In the last 10 years, our country has lost, on average, 10 factories and 2,000 manufacturing jobs every day. It is impossible for a modern civilization to continue in a healthy way when only 4% of its people make things. Yet that is what has happened to us. It has happened to us because the Congress especially, and politicians, and not all of them, we have had principled people, hardworking people, admirable people in our Congress. But by and large, as things have gone along, we have gotten more and more of these people who want power and have subverted the situation in our Congress and in our executive and judicial branches until our government has become such a burden to us that we can no longer compete and even create enough things to maintain our own prosperity. This, if it continues, will end the experiment our founders started. We were a U-turn in history. We owe the maintenance of that to our children, our grandchildren, and to the entire world, because we are the example by which billions of people today are trying to lift themselves from liberty and tyranny by the example of the United States. Many of these countries, some of them only half free today, are using our own methods of excellence, which we can't use because our Congress prevents us. So what you have, we wonder, and I'm sure we're going to win this because I've been working on it for 2 years. I'm out among it's a wonderful experience. I've spoken before thousands and thousands of thousands of people in District 4, and I haven't seen one yet that I wouldn't be proud to have in my family for dinner, in my home for dinner. The American people are wonderful people, but we need to educate them to the point that they understand this. I am sure that if the American people understand what has happened to them and understand the situation, that 75% of them or more will vote for the side of the political spectrum that we represent. I think if Thomas Paine were here today, he would say that it's not common sense that a people that has been free for 250 years will give up their freedom to a gaggle of politicians and bureaucrats that they have employed in Washington. We're not going to do it. And I am certain, I don't know, remember, it took a while to get into this problem. You mustn't think that one election, well, this Barack Obama is a pretty good incentive to think that one election means everything. But you mustn't think that we can get our whole country back in 1 year or 2 years or one election or two elections. It's taken us decades to get into this problem. But all across the country, the strength of the pro-liberty movements are growing. You saw it here. Go down that line of pavilions out there, come up the other end. People that talked here, people that aren't. Do you know how many pro-liberty organizations there are just in a little congressional district? And they're all different. In terms of political parties, there's the Republican Party. But there are big elements of the Democrat Party. Ask Matthew, he got 11% of their votes. There are elements in the Democrat Party, the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party. The Constitution Party, I didn't even talk to them. They sent me a letter saying, we had our convention. By the way, we nominated you. I didn't even know. The Ron Paul people. All of these are movements for liberty. And they're all congealing now in a tremendous coalition that is going to sweep these people before us. Once we get our country back, we'll start arguing again about our differences. That's what's going on. It's growing stronger and stronger and stronger. I've given 41 speeches in the last 2 months, and the audiences have been much more motivated, much more animated, and much more dedicated to this. There's no question we're winning. I don't know how long it'll take, but we'll do our best to do one little job in Oregon. As a public service, a little group of scientists down in Cave Junction is going to get rid of one corrupt congressman. That's our job.